like things have settled a little bit on participants, or people are still kind of slowly coming in. But I think I can go ahead and kind of launch, and because we got a series of intros. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. We're really excited about this lecture and discussion, really a unique format. I wanted to give thanks to this is a Fumihiko Maki Lecture, sponsored lecture. So Fumihiko Maki Lecture Series recognizes annually an architect or group of architects and artists, urbanists, landscape of international reputation whose work advances the optimism and strength of modern architecture. The lecture was established by the Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design to honor renowned architect and former faculty member Fumihiko Maki, architect of Steinberg Hall, Earl E. and Myrtle E. Walker Hall, and the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, all part of the Sam Fox School complex. Past Maki lectures have included Ben Van Berkel, David Chipperfield, Charles Correa, Tom Kundig, James Polsick, Stephen Hall, Herman Osberger, Wang Shu, Tom Main, Michael Murphy, Jesse Reiser, Nanaka Umamoto, Carlos Ott, and Pierre Belanger, among others. I also want to mention our upcoming lectures. In particular, on October 21st, we have Kenneth Frampton. And then on October 22nd, there'll be a book launch for Eric Mumford, who will be including Kenneth Frampton among a series of other really great panelists. So be on the lookout for that. And my last kind of point is if anyone wants to get AIA credits, you can put your name and AIA number in the chat, and I will be recording that. So with that, I want to hand off to Robert McCarter, who will start off the introductions.
Yes, good evening. My name is Robert McCarter. I'm the Ruth and Norman Moore Professor and co-chair of the lectures group with Chandler. Welcome to the Fumihiko Maki Lecture, and this particularly unique lecture, which I suppose is some kind of an outgrowth of what we how we responded to the COVID by switching to lectures, which we found not only could you have lectures, but you can invite people from all over the place who aren't in the same place to meet together. So this is, we are now having in-person lectures again, but this is sort of something that I don't think we would have come up with if it hadn't been for the stimulation of that event. So we have 6 members of the team that worked on the memorial to enslaved laborers at the University of Virginia who were joining us today. I will introduce them, I think, in the order that they are on the slide that you're hopefully seeing at the moment. We begin with Eric Höweler and Meejin Yoon. They're co-founders of Höweler and Yoon, an award-winning design studio engaged in projects throughout the US and around the world. Recent publications of their firm's work include Expanded Practice for 2009 and Verify in Fields, which I believe is forthcoming this year. In addition, Meijin Yoon is the Gale and Ira Druckier Dean of the College of Architecture, Art, and Planning at Cornell University, beginning in 2019, and she was previously the head of architecture, the head of the architecture department at MIT. Eric Höweler is an associate professor of architecture and is the architecture thesis coordinator at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. Mabel O. Wilson is the Nancy and George Rupp Professor of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She's also a professor in African American and African Diasporic Studies and director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, all at Columbia University. In the Graduate School of Architecture, she's also the co-director of the Global Africa Lab. Wilson's practice, Studio and, has been a competition finalist for several important cultural institutions, including Lower Manhattan's African Burial Ground Memorial and the Smithsonian's National Museum for African American History and Culture, which she entered with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. Wilson's publications begin with the past, building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, 2016, Negro Building, Black Americans in the World of Fairs and Museums, which is originally 2012, but I believe was just come out in paperback this year, 2021. And she co-edited the first volume of Race and Modern Architecture, which came out in 2020. Frank Dukes, PhD, is a mediator and facilitator with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at the University of Virginia. He founded the University and Community Action for Racial Equality to address UVA's legacy of slavery and white supremacy. He was a member of Charlottesville's Commission on Race, Memorials, and Public Spaces, which determines the disposition of the city's Confederate statues, among other things. He's currently chair of the board of the anti-hate group Not in Our Town, and he led the community engagement as a member of the design team for the University of Virginia Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. Gregg Bleam is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects and is principal of Gregg Bleam Landscape Architecture, which is based in Charlottesville, Virginia. Prior to establishing his own firm, Bleam was an associate in the office of Dan Urban Kiley in Charlotte, Vermont. From 1987 to 97, I believe he taught at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, teaching graduate and undergraduate landscape and architecture courses. His firm's modernist landscape designs have been recognized by awards from the ASLA and the AIA. And as I was mentioning to him, because this is the first time I've met him even virtually, I know his work through his designs for the landscape of several projects for W.G. Clark in Charlottesville. Last but not least is Eto O.T. Tigbe, who is a polymedia artist whose interdisciplinary practice investigates the intersections of race, power, and technology, with history as a foundation for exploration. O.T. Tigbe sets alternative narratives into motion, creating spaces for people to experience a unique mixture of concepts. His work has been in national and international exhibitions such as Topophilia, the Meetings Festival in Denmark, Bronx Calling, the second AIM Biennial and the Bronx Museum and Wave Hill. He has participated in residencies at Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, the Warfield Center for African and African American Studies in Austin, Texas, 701 CCA in Columbia, South Carolina, Center for Book Arts in New York, and the Luminary Center for the Arts here in St. Louis. O.T. Tigbe lives and works in Brooklyn, New York, where he is assistant professor and head of the sculpture at the art department of Brooklyn College. Now, with that, I will pass the baton to my colleague Chantel Blakely to introduce the Washington University respondents.
Hi, I'm Chantel Blakely. I'm assistant professor of architecture here at Washington University. We're pleased to be joined today by two respondents who are both here at Washington University. James Kolker is Associate Vice Chancellor and University Architect here, a licensed architect, fellow of the AIA. He joined Washington University in 2010. His responsibilities include long-term planning, design, and development of all university facilities and campuses, including the Danforth campus, North and West campuses, and the medical school. In his role, he also oversees different kinds of capital projects, from new construction to preservation and management of the uses of university spaces, and he coordinates with related divisions across the university in order to ensure that all capital projects will remain in line with the university's primary missions of teaching, research, and patient care. We're also joined by Jeff Ward, who is Professor of African and African American Studies and faculty affiliate in the Department of Sociology and American Culture Studies program at Washington University. His current projects focus on histories of racist violence, their legacies, and implications for repair. Ward serves as director of Wash U and Slavery, an initiative of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, in partnership with the Global Consortium of Universities Studying Slavery. He's also involved in several related community-based initiatives, including the Mayor's Commemorative Landscape Task Force in Clayton, Missouri, and the Reparative Justice Coalition of St. Louis. And now I will hand over to the team to present.
Thanks so much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, great. So I want to thank everyone for this opportunity to present and share the story of the memorial to enslaved laborers. I have the pleasure of introducing our team. And first, I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of all our lands and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land which we all sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation, the Cayuga Nation, the Monacan people, the Karnasi Lenape, and the Munsee Lenape people. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and the forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to these lands on which we sit today. The memorial is truly the work of many, all whom have a strong sense of ownership, not only of the memorial, but the larger work of racial justice that it represents. From the students that initiated the idea of the memorial, to the faculty and alumni who advocated for the memorial, to the university and the Office of the Architect and the leadership that stewarded the memorial, and to the community ambassadors, the descendant community, to the builders and fabricators whose hearts and hands crafted the memorial. So we're very honored to share with you as just a small part of the memorial design to fruition process. Mabel, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. So we were just going to keep going. So in reflecting upon how Black history is American history, James Baldwin made the following sobering observation. He said, quote, "I think that one of the stumbling blocks is that the nature of the Black experience in this country does indicate something about the total American history, which frightens Americans," end quote. To tell the history of the United States requires reckoning with hard truths, with those histories that have been silenced in the nation's archives and in the public spaces of our shared landscapes. Next, please. What are the stories to be told of the estimated 4,000 men, women, and children who built, worked, and lived at the University of Virginia from its founding in 1817 to the end of the Civil War that ended their enslavement? And as you can see from this historical marker on University and Avenue in Charlottesville, very near and in front of UVA's iconic Rotunda, the standard history is stated with no mention of slavery. Next, please. Silenced were the voices and contributions of the enslaved people, my ancestors, who built many of our hallowed civic structures, built the country for that matter, which demonstrates how white supremacy is still embedded into many of our systems, including our built environment.
So you're looking at the first official recognition of this hidden history in the form of an expression of regret issued by UVA's Board of Visitors in 2007. That echoed the Virginia General Assembly's expression of regret that same year. Now, neither statement used the language of apology, which had been proposed in the General Assembly, but was rejected out of concern that it would imply liability and a need for action, repair, reparations. So at the same time, the Board of Visitors of UVA authorized installation of this plaque in the floor of the walkway in front of the rotunda, co-equal with the recognition given to white craftsmen and builders who worked on the university a few steps away. But this plaque had the unanticipated consequences sparking student outrage. So in the fall of 2007, I assigned students in my class for brand new students, writing on right or wrong, to find this marker that acknowledged slavery at UVA. So all the students had undoubtedly walked over this marker or even on it without noticing it. Students were dismayed at the limits of this recognition. that it was underfoot, not only nearly hidden, but trampled on, that it barely mentioned the enslaved and ignored their role in the nearly 40 years after UVA opened, and that it so directly centered Jefferson at the same time. So this outrage then ended up forming the base momentum for creating a proper memorial. Next, yeah. So that same year, a small group of us began developing what became UCARE, U-C-A-R-E, or the University and Community Action for Racial Equity. UCARE involved community members and students, staff, and faculty using a framework of truth, understanding, repair, and relationship to tell the long hidden truths of our racialized history, to understand the impacts of those truths on the community and on so many ongoing racial disparities, to develop repairs both within UVA and the community outside, and then to sustain an authentic relationship between the community and UVA. Ishraga Eltahir, seen on the right, joined our first group of student interns. Ishraga was in that 2007 class that I taught, was dismayed at that marker, and she was determined that the marker would not remain the only recognition of the enslaved. In 2009, 2010, she began hosting, along with our UCARE interns, she began hosting meetings with students, staff, faculty, and community members to develop support for a different memorial. Next. So with Ishraga's leadership, the students formed an organization that was recognized by Student Council as the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers, known as MEL. And this group then sponsored the student design competition in 2011 to raise awareness and promote interest in building a more appropriate memorial. So you see some of the entries in that. This hidden history became even more tangible to the community when archaeologists discovered 70 unmarked graves behind the university's official cemetery. I should say the official white cemetery. These unmarked graves are thought to be the graves of the quote unquote servants, the euphemism for the enslaved, that were referenced in reminiscences by former students in the late 19th century. The image that you see is the last portion of a ceremony of memorialization that began in the community and that ended in that cemetery. And that was the first real public recognition that we had of that. Next. So in that same year, 2013, then UVA President Teresa Sullivan created the President's Commission on Slavery in the University with the charge to provide her with recommendations regarding the recognition and acknowledgement of history at slavery at the University of Virginia. Next. So in the subsequent years of its 5-year lifespan, that President's Commission undertook many actions, including the creation of a walking tour of sites related to enslavement that you can see there. And this tour, by the way, is now available online at the university's website. Next. And then in 2016, the President's Commission sponsored a symposium on the topic of memorialization, well attended by the community and university leaders, including President Sullivan in the middle there with the glasses on. And the panel included, by now, 5-year alumnus Ishraga Eltahir, the founding student member of MEL, and a member of the Board of Visitors, Rusty Connor, who was the chair of the Building and Grounds Committee, who made a very visible leadership presence and expressed public support for the construction of a memorial, the first time that it had happened with any leader.
So when it opened in 1826, the University of Virginia's 10 pavilions housed faculty and family. Its lawn rooms boarded 125 white male students, and the verdant swath of the terrace lawn, as seen here in this etching, was crowned by the Rotunda, the centerpiece of the ensemble that housed the library. In his plans for what he called the academical village, Thomas Jefferson, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the second governor of Virginia, the third president of the United States, plantation owner, and owner of 600 enslaved men, women, and children over the course of his life, brought together an exclusive community in an environment he designed to be conducive, quote, to health, to study, to manners, morals, and order, end quote. Next, please. But what recently remained silent in official historical narratives about the university's antebellum period from 1817 to 1865 was mention of the academical village's dependency on an equal number of, roughly 150 at one time, enslaved. And as we see here, a woman taking care of a child at the on the balcony of one of the pavilions, I believe Pavilion 9. And this is, we could see this was in the previous image in the, what was a cartouche and a very well-known map of Virginia. So this history hid in plain sight for 155 years. Next, please. So along with clearing and terracing the area known as the lawn, or felling trees and milling them into planks, it was mostly enslaved workers, many young boys, for example, who did the back-breaking labor of digging clay, filling molds, and firing the bricks for the estimated 1.2 million bricks for the Rotunda. The fingerprints on the bricks, like these in Monticello, this is actually an image from Monticello, not at UVA, because many of the bricks at UVA have been replaced in areas that are actually visible. These bricks have stories to tell. And so as a design team, our challenge was to make these materials speak and to develop methods to thoughtfully remember this community of friends, family, and fellow workers, to revive their humanity while never forgetting the dehumanizing violence of enslavement. But someone in their community had remembered, and her name was Isabella Gibbons. She was a teacher and founder of the Freedmen's School, which became the Jefferson School in Charlottesville. She is the only member of the enslaved community at UVA from which the archives have yielded a full name, a date of death, a photograph, and a brief written record of her experiences. She serves as a witness for her community, and this is what she remembers, quote, "Can we forget the crack of the whip, cowhide, whipping posts, the auction block, the handcuff, the spaniels, the iron collar, the Negro trader tearing the young child from its mother's breast as a whelp from the lioness? Have we forgotten by these horrible cruelties, hundreds of our race have been killed? No, we have not, or ever will," end quote. And this appears in the memorial on the historical timeline at its end. Once emancipated from enslavement at UVA, Gibbons joined a vibrant Black community, one that now struggled against Jim Crow's oppression, white supremacy, in a different, but still deadly guise. Next, please.
So it's important to recognize, and I think that it's clear that this design team was selected among the others because we did not come in with a design. We did not come in with a proposal. We came in saying that we were going to go into the community and talk to the descendants and talk to the students and talk to others, alumni, and invite them to tell us what was most meaningful about this memorial. So you can see now it's tiny letters, but if you look above, a highly compressed timeline of the intensive engagement process. So over the course of about 6 months, we engaged multiple stakeholders on their turf, going from classrooms at UVA with students and alumni to local community members at the Jefferson School's African American Heritage Center, to members of local historic African American churches, and to the presidential homes of Jefferson and Madison to talk to members of the descendants of those who were enslaved there. We did so not asking what this memorial should look like, but asking what meaning should the memorial convey? What do you want to feel when you see it? What stories do you need to take away from it? We also worked with an incredible group of community ambassadors that reached out to other school and church groups, including one descendant, Diane Brown Towns, who went to 10 different groups herself. It became clear through that engagement process that for memorial to have both meaning and relevance to the multiple publics, it of course had to honor the lives of the enslaved, but it also had to advance a commemorative landscape for racial justice today.
So as Mabel and Frank have shown, while the architecture of Jefferson is on one hand associated with the ideals of democracy, its foundations were literally built on enslavement. And the traces of that enslavement are not only legible in its bricks, but also embedded in its constructed landscape. How then to design and add to this landscape an accounting for and an accounting of the lives of the enslaved was our design challenge. The question of whose histories, whose stories, and whose voices were very critical. And the memorial had to engage both difficult institutional histories as well as the public history of the community. In engaging the multiple communities, what we heard was that the memorial would need to tell the unvarnished truth about the about the past to have any legitimacy, that it needed to bring the community together to both learn and reflect on that history, that it needed to express dualities, not only the pain and suffering, but also the resilience, dignity, and humanity of those who were enslaved. And lastly, that it needed to be a living memorial, an ongoing memorial to acknowledge that the work of this commemorative landscape remains incomplete. So in order to design the project, we first had to start by designing a process, which Frank shared, one that foregrounded dialogue and openness and brought the public into their early concept design. The project was unusual because in the beginning there were no sites, no site, there was no budget. So we had the opportunity to test multiple sites and approaches, including distributed memorials or an ephemeral memorial, using quick sketches to draw out conversations and aspirations between committees and communities. And what became clear was that in contrast to many monuments that stand as objects in space, the Memorial for Enslaved Laborers needed to be a space for the people of the present to gather to recognize the legacy of the past.
So along with collecting the aspirations that Meejin just described and hearing about desired meanings and experiences and the stories that needed to be told by the memorial, as part of our design process, we also researched Black traditions and spaces of gathering. As part of this process, we looked to and for cultural forms and rituals that could be translated into our design. And so, for instance, we explored how people gathered to perform ring shouts, a low country ecstatic dance that moves in a circle and whose rhythm and movements connect to West African practices. Hush harbors, which you see in the middle, taught us about how enslaved communities gathered in the forests and clearings that were mobilized for convenings of religious rituals and for ceremonies of burials, as well as for plotting insurrections and escapes to freedom. Water became a means to tell the story of liberation, which can be found in West African libation rituals that honor the spirits of ancestors, and also by the currents of rivers that carried people to freedom. When we met the Mel student group very early on in the design process, they asked us to consider a memorial design that could be a meeting ground for activism, as well as a place to learn about Black history. We heard in our outreach meetings, as Meejin mentioned, that the memorial should forge a connection with the community. And in response, and after careful study, we sited the memorial in the area known as the Triangle of Grass, a threshold to UVA's grounds, making it visible and accessible to the wider community. The memorial joins, and as you could see here in the diagram, a local commemorative landscape. Its circular lawn was designed to be a gathering place for events such as the yearly Freedom and Liberation Day March on March 3rd that remembers the day that Union troops liberated the 14,000 enslaved persons in Albemarle County. Next.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick up. So this image here is showing the Triangle of Grass on Freedom Day, when many residents and descendants and members of the community gathered to sort of map out the sort of footprint of this ring that we were proposing. On its most basic level, the memorial is a sort of opening or gathering space to be filled with people on special events. Next, please. So this diagram shows the proximity of the memorial to the rotunda. It's designed to be in dialogue with the rotunda, which sits at the highest point of the lawn. Jefferson designed the academical village on a ridgeline so that the rotunda would sit at the top of the ridge, and the terracing of the lawn allows for the pavilions that front it to be 2 stories on the lawn side, but actually 3 stories on the back sides. And that sort of conforms with the section of the topography. So the 3rd floor underneath the two-story pavilions is actually making room for the living and workspaces of the enslaved. And the gardens behind the pavilions, which today are quite iconic and famous, these were not the pristine gardens that we see today. These were labor yards where the enslaved worked, chopping firewood, slaughtering animals, hauling water. And so the sort of section that Thomas Jefferson employed as an architect actually allowed him to sort of preserve a kind of pristine image of a uniform, almost utopian sort of community on the interior of the lawn, but conceal the labor of the enslaved underneath it in its section and sort of facing outward. And so from this, we sort of, working with historians, reading these sort of nuances in the architecture, we could deduce that Jefferson actually found slavery to be abhorrent, and he used architecture as a means to conceal it. The memorial architecture that we proposed is in contrast to the architecture of Jefferson, which is axial, frontal, formal. Instead, we chose a kind of landscape strategy, a strategy of integration into the topography, not to produce a kind of closed or concealing figure, but to sort of create a space embedded in the landscape that would sort of open and invite the visitor in. Next, please. So this model in this diagram shows the geometry of the memorial. It is located tangent to a primary path that connects the city of Charlottesville to the academical village. So it's not axial or frontal, it's actually just tangential. You could walk right by it. And that tangent relationship, I think, is important because it allows the visitor to sort of exercise their sort of will to enter. The geometry of the memorial itself is a combination of intersecting cones, slightly on a different axis, that produces a very low wall at the front, which rises up towards the back and produces what we call a kind of new horizon. Next, please. And so the memorial consists of a number of rings. There's the sort of lawn in the middle as a kind of empty gathering space, but there are multiple layers, including a layer for a timeline and a water feature, a layer for the inscription of names, which we'll talk about further. And the outermost layer has embedded in it the artwork created by Eto, which he'll talk about shortly. Next, please. The memorial is made of one material. It's made of Virginia mist granite. And this is a local granite that was quarried from a quarry not far from Charlottesville. The idea was to use stone and find lots of expressions, so different finishes and textures, different treatments that would sort of tell different stories on the inside and the outside and create a sense of contrast between the inner smooth space of the memorial and the kind of rough textured outer space facing the community. Next, please. So this is a view across the memorial from the tangent path you see cutting across. And you can see how the low walls are really low and it's really inviting. It's very easy to enter. As you enter the memorial, you can either go clockwise or counterclockwise, and the path ramps down gently. And as it ramps down, the surrounding wall lifts up gently. And so it produces a kind of horizon. Before you know it, you've taken a few steps, you've started to read the content, and before you know it, you've masked out all the context. And all of a sudden, all of your sort of perception and attention is focused inward. And this was a kind of deliberate attempt to create a sense of intimacy, a sense of contemplation embedded in a landscape that has all this difficult history. Next, please. So from the architectural section, you can see the sort of slow ramp down. You can see the kind of profile of the outer wall of the memorial. And we were using section, again, to sort of embed the memorial in the ground to create the memorial as a landform that was able to sort of convey the multiple meanings and content that we were intending to convey. Next, please. This close-up section shows the water feature right around bench height. The water feature contains within it a timeline describing events in the history of slavery and the university. And the opposed wall, the wall that faces the hill, consists of two angles. And in this case, we're cutting at the high point where the wall is at about 8 feet. And that allows for this introspection that I was referring to earlier. Next, please. When we mocked this up in our studio, we tested the angle of the wall. And we note that if you stand at the wall with your foot at the base of the wall and you reach your arm out, that you connect the line between your toe and your hand. And in a way, that line sort of forms the sort of angle of inclination of that outer wall. In a way, it kind of inscribes the body in the wall. So when you're there, it feels quite comfortable. It feels like you're almost sort of, in a way, you're sort of making the curvature with the sort of gesture of your arm. And from the outside, the horizon line works as well. And so standing on the grounds outside the memorial, it conceals what's happening within and sort of creates another horizon looking into the memorial. Next, please. Here's the mock-up that we performed in the stone fabrication yard, just to verify some of these proportions. We can mock things up with tape and drawings on the wall. In this case, we actually mocked it up with stone before the blocks shipped to Charlottesville. And I'm going to hand it over to Gregg. Thanks.
Thank you. As has been mentioned, our team explored numerous sites in the grounds of UVA before we settled on the Triangle of Grass location. The reason for selecting this site, out of the many that we studied, was based upon feedback from our community meetings in which city residents expressed their strong preference for a site that was visible and accessible to the city of Charlottesville. One of our original postcard sketch diagrams shown here indicates the preliminary siting of the memorial. Next. As the team's landscape architectural firm, our challenge was to transform the sloped grass plain of the site to accommodate the memorial, making it appear that it was always there. Creating an 80-foot diameter flat circle for the memorial required cutting into the sloping site, both to make it accessible and to allow the contours to align with the northern escape path. The site transformation required numerous drawing iterations in order to knit the memorial harmoniously with the surrounding landscape. Next. Our final landscape plan indicates the passage of time. The memorial is oriented to the north, and the northern escape path is marked by 48 granite stones, referencing the 48 years that the university depended upon enslaved labor. The diagonal brick path leading to the memorial aligns with the March 3rd angle of the setting sun, which is Liberation and Freedom Day. As has been mentioned, March 3rd, 1865 was the day the Union troops liberated the more than 14,000 enslaved persons in Albemarle County. Liberation and Freedom Day is also referenced in the planting at the center of the memorial, I should say proposed planting. The circular lawn will be planted with 14,000 flowering crocus bulbs that will bloom in February, which is Black History Month, and continue to flower through March 3rd. Each planted bulb represents one enslaved person freed on that day. Additionally, the ephemeral quality of the flowers brings awareness to those who have been overlooked in American history. After the flowers fade, the lawn will return to a space for gathering. Next.
So to develop the layers of history in the memorial, we worked closely with a group of committed historians, many of who sat on the President's Commission to study slavery at the university, and whose thoughtful examination of UVA's enslaved community and its history of slavery provided much rich material. To name names, to tell the story of the enslaved community required that we engage with an archive of work ledgers and personal letters of slave owners. And as such, it was an archive of daily life, one laced with silences and violence. Now, it should be said that the university owned 2 or 3 enslaved persons, but it rented the majority of workers to build the university and take care of the grounds. However, the professors owned slaves who cooked and cleaned and took care of their families and maintained the classrooms where students learned. And the hotel owners, and the hotels are on the outer range, where students ate, also owned enslaved people who cooked and served and cared for and cleaned the student rooms. Next, please. Historians estimate that about 4,000 men, women, and children built and labored and lived at UVA in the period from 1817 to 1865. But unfortunately, we know very little, almost nothing about the detail of their lives. But all in the memorial are recognized by what we've called memory marks, which are arrayed across the inner arc of the memorial. And so for most, which to be exact is 3,111 persons, the archives do not record a first name or a last name. As the spreadsheet on the right shows, we found records for 889 persons, but not all of the records recorded names, and sometimes a citation like 3 Negro hands were hired or rented. Now, of those 889 references, we know mostly the first name of about 577 community members. And for a handful of people like Isabella Gibbons, Sally Cottrell, or Henry Martin, we know first and last names. And so for the remaining 311 unknowns, we recorded, of recorded people, we decided to use kinship relations and occupations to remember their lives. Next slide, please. So here you see that sort of inner surface, and you see the ways in which the marks, sort of spread across that surface, and you can start to see some of the veining of the granite. And so as a result of our research and in conversation with the descendant community, yielded this sort of what we call a genealogical cloud of the community that stretches across the inner surface of the memorial. And so as you walk in, you become enveloped by this cloud of names and relationships. Next, please. Right. So the list of names is a traditional feature of Western memorials, as are dates, for example. And so we had to reimagine those names as social relations, which rehumanize the experience of the enslaved. And so as a result, visitors engage Henry, Isabella, Jane, Jack, Robert, and Randall as families of sisters and grandmothers, uncles, and friends, as workers who took pride in their work as woodcutters, janitors, laundresses, and fiddlers. And carved into the granite, as you could see below each name, are 4,000 memory marks that speak back, sometimes with tears, to their descendants and to us. And so that tactility that Eric described of the granite draws us to it, to be touched and to touch. Next, please. Oh, and so here you could see the names remembering the enslaved from a bench with the timeline and a water feature that captures the attention of visitors who learn a different history of the university.
So in contrast to the wall of marks and names, which rises and inclines outward, a shallow, near level water table shares with visitors the history of enslavement at the university. It's positioned just below the knee, and to read, visitors need to lean in almost in a bowing posture to read the entries on the timeline. The 70 entries inscribed into the water table begin with the arrival of the enslaved to Virginia in 1619 and ends with the passing of Isabella Gibbons in 1890. It covers the arrival of 10 enslaved laborers to clear the land that would become UVA in 1817, and covers a history of transactions, work, and violence. I wanted to read just a few sample entries. 1820 to 22, Sam works for 2 years at the university as a blacksmith. 1832, 3 professors purchase Lewis Commodore at public auction for the school's use. They are later reimbursed and he becomes UVA's property. In 1856, an enslaved 11-year-old girl is beaten unconscious by a UVA student. Claiming his right to discipline any slave, he suffers no consequence. The distinct matter-of-fact tone of the timeline entries paints the difficult and unvarnished history of life and violence of slavery with poignancy. Each word was painstakingly deliberated and debated by a committee of historians, including members of the design team, for nuance and meaning. And we often think of history as a given, but in this case, we witness the active writing of history from an archive of slavery that brings hidden truths out in the open as a rich and difficult public history to be shared and discussed in the public space of the memorial. And in reference to the libation rituals and the currents of rivers that carried people to freedom, which Mabel highlighted earlier, a steady stream of shallow water washes over the entire arc of the timeline. Eto?
As shared, the design was informed by an extensive community engagement process that clarified the importance of a visual representation of enslaved people, the desire for imagery that portrayed triumph over despair, and visual cues to suggest who the enslaved people were, how they lived, and what they did. These conversations took place at UVA and around Charlottesville and Albemarle County in places such as the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, the Jefferson School, Charlottesville High School, and the Monticello and Montpelier plantations. They included genealogical groups who could trace their ancestry to the people who were enslaved in Charlottesville and by UVA. Next slide. I was invited to the team to research and design a response to the community perspectives and develop an expression for the exterior surface of the memorial that would complement design elements on the interior surface of the memorial, the memory marks, and the libation timeline. We became interested in layering information we gleaned from these conversations, historical sites, and archives, such as rare photographs of people who were enslaved by UVA. Rough tombstones from the Daughters of Zion African American burial ground, and vertical quarry marks in stone that would soon be worked away by skilled masons. Another reason I was invited to the team relates to an ongoing project called Becoming Visible that I started around 2012. A series of self-portraits portray and pay homage to Trayvon Martin, and also challenge the social media's role in sensationalizing the killing of innocent African Americans. The series relies on software to generate photorealistic carvings. The technique was inspired by traditional wood carvings and bronze statues from Benin in West Africa. These historical objects depict the king of Benin, or Oba, with contoured lines on his face. Traditionally, some ethnic groups in Africa use scarification as a means of taxonomy. In this case, I used engraved lines to generate an image of my own face with an expression of solidarity for the families of innocent African American people whose lives were taken unjustly. We can imagine so many of their names and faces, even with our eyes wide open. Next slide. Yes, right here. One of the thousands of people who were enslaved at UVA that we were able to locate a photograph of was Isabella Gibbons. Now, there were only 4 or 5 photographs in total of different people who were enslaved by UVA. We're looking now at a close-up of that particular photograph of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. The original image is in the archives of the Boston Public Library. She was enslaved by Professor William Barton Rogers, who was actually one of the founders of MIT. She operated on the spectrum of resistance as someone who taught herself and others to read and write while they were enslaved. She was witness to freedom and liberation in Charlottesville when, as previously mentioned, 14,000 people were no longer owned as property. Isabella and her family remained in the area, and as Mabel mentioned, she became a teacher at the Freedman School until her death. One of her descendants is a UVA Architecture School graduate, so in many ways, she exemplifies the spirit of triumph over despair. To realize the relief image in stone, we had to develop a unique process and custom software. First, we needed to translate intensity data from a photograph into a virtual model. Then we generated a machine toolpath to create a virtual surface that was overlaid on a digital model of the memorial's curved surface. All this took place digitally, working with remote teams before we even cut into stone. Next slide. During the design and fabrication phase, we worked with Quara Stone Company in Madison, Wisconsin. Their stone carving and technical facilities are outstanding, as we can see from this video here of a robot arm with a saw blade that's carving one of the actual blocks of the memorial. With them, we developed a custom parametric carving technique using Rhino and Grasshopper. This allowed us to work with variables such as material, geometry, and scale. The stone that you see here is Virginia Mist. It's a dark granite from a quarry in Culpeper, Virginia, not far from UVA. With Quora, we developed an understanding of how the final appearance varies under different lighting conditions and surface finishes. Next slide. This project ties together so many sensitive and unsettled themes. The memorial is a large conically curved surface overlaid with gouge patterns, a metaphor for weathered, scarred skin and rough-hewn stone. The photo-carved portrait is approximately 8 feet by 39 feet. Typically, this photo carving technique is used for flat surfaces. Even in the development process, we needed to make full-scale mock-ups to test the concept for legibility of the eyes and better understand the user experience. Next slide. Here we see a section of the memorial's exterior surface engraved with an image of Isabella Gibbons' eyes. From various positions, we can view the memorial and reflect on those that it's meant to honor. The eyes are symbolic of all those who were enslaved and their descendants who witnessed this change and hopefully more positive change for Black people. The gaze is directed out, into, and beyond the city of Charlottesville. Together, the image suggests a Colossus figure, no longer hidden, rising from the ground, becoming visible.
In many ways, Isabella was with us from the beginning, and she remains both a watcher and a witness over the memorial. The memorial, as I shared earlier, was an effort of many, many individuals, without which it could not have happened. The students that began the process 10 years earlier, to the advocacy of the individuals at UVA. We wanted to also share the incredible commitment of Devon Henry, of Team Henry, Black-owned local business, which was instrumental in ensuring that the project was executed with excellence. Another key member was, of course, Cora Stone, who fabricated, delivered, and installed the work with incredible craftsmanship and precision. And so in addition to those who took great care, I just wanted to thank my collaborators. The project was fundamentally not only creating a new horizon line on the campus, but a new way of working, I think, for all of us. And the kind of precision of the way things came together, or the great care, I think was only possible because of this very special design team. Here we see a view from the exterior finished memorial, which highlights those dualities that we mentioned earlier, the pain and the violence, as well as the dignity and humanity, and the many layers of meaning that come together as a whole. Here we see the high contrast between the smooth and the somber interior and the rough and striated exterior. The landform quality and the concave and convex meeting to communicate something for which I think we are all still struggling to find words. The community ambassadors shared that they wanted Charlottesville and the Albemarle communities to have a stake in the memorial's historic significance, and that intergenerational investment was important to these transformative history-making moments. And so, in the words of one of the community ambassadors that Frank mentioned, Diane Town Browns, she said, "The memorial is like a living, breathing organism. It will most likely take on whatever meaning we ascribe to it. And as we each take ownership of its space and place, let us be mindful that we can decidedly bring forth the energies of disruption and division, or the power of intent to repair, heal, and unify.
So the engagement continues to make this a living memorial. As construction began, UVA hired a genealogist on the right, Dr. Shelley Murphy, to trace the descendants of the enslaved whose names have been discovered by the historians and inscribed upon the wall of the memorial. Here we have two of them, Tatisa Gathers and Colleen Yates, who are local activists and leaders in the descendant community. They're also key members of an ongoing community engagement committee that was formed during construction to determine memorialization and to consult on education, a new website, and other issues, including the dedication. But most importantly, to continue to connect UVA staff and faculty with community members. There's also a descendant committee made up entirely of descendants that consults with the historians on a regular basis. And that committee in the engagement process prompted the formation of a brand new group, now with nonprofit status, called the Descendants of the Enslaved Communities at UVA. That group has an ambitious program of education and policies intended to eradicate the racial disparities that prompted the memorial to begin with. And so now we're going to hear from
when you shared your screen, you have to share the audio as well. So you may have to stop share and then reshare with the audio.
Meejin, do you want to go? Do you want to stop?
Yeah, sorry. Frank, why don't you keep going? I
Okay.
don't think I can do the audio.
Okay. So that was Jess Harris, who was a student at the time, was a member of the engagement committee, and has discovered, and she's local from Fluvanna County, nearby county, that she is a descendant also through this engagement process. And talking about that meaning. So there are also many others who help bring the memorial to life, all of whom have a strong sense of ownership, as Meejin noted earlier, not only in the memorial, but the larger work of racial justice that it represents. The key members of the larger team are listed here, and we owe so much to many people, deep gratitude for encouragement, participation, and support of this process.
So the memorial is a living and breathing organism, as Diane's words asserted. And when new names come to light, as some did recently, they will rejoin their community. The new names have been carved into the granite, and people will gather to enact a new commemorative ritual. Next, please. And in fact, in January of 2021, 5 names were added: Davy Hearn, Fanny Gillette Hearn, Bonnie Castle Hearn, Lily Hearn, and Ben Snowden. They were all relatives of Thrimston Hearn, but were at the university later than Thrimston, arriving after Jefferson's death. Next, please. So the memorial's reflective and inscribed surfaces, its paths and gathering spaces, commemorate a community of Black men, women, and children who lived lives, who worked and played, wept, died, escaped, resisted, and refused enslavement together. By remembering their suffering, their dignity, their freedom, as did the protest after the construction offense was removed, organized by UVA's medical school group, it's called White Coats for Black Lives, who took the knee in remembrance of the murder of George Floyd, a gruesome reminder that the violence and injustices that persist in the wake of slavery.
The Memorial for Enslaved Laborers at UVA came into fruition through a collective desire to face the past, to reckon with truths, including the horrible cruelties as the Gibbons quote on the timeline described, with Isabella as the witness for and the watcher of her community. The memorial brings together their lives, known and unknown, to ours. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing. I'd like to ask the 2 representatives of Washington University to give us a response. Can we start with Geoff Ward? if that's all right, or?
Sure. I'm happy to start, and I want to start by thanking the group, the team, and the community behind the development of this incredible and important memorial for the work you've done and the example you've set here. It is an inspiration, and my comments really are, come from the perspective of an historical sociologist who has been studying histories and legacies of racial violence for many years, and someone particularly interested in the reparative work that memorials can facilitate. So my remarks are going to briefly consider that question. For context, I want to share that there's a large body of social science and humanities research showing that histories of slavery and lynching and other racialized violence continue to shape patterns of conflict, violence, and inequality today. Contemporary patterns of voter suppression, of white supremacist mobilization, of homicide, capital punishment, corporal punishment in schools, health disparity, and the list goes on and on, are linked to histories of slavery, lynching, and other racialized violence. And while questions remain in this work, the evidence that we socially embody and reproduce historical trauma is overwhelming. The question then arises, what do we do about it? And clearly part of that answer is that we must work to process and integrate historical trauma. We know from scholars in trauma studies that telling and witnessing are critical critical for healing trauma. And I think this is fundamental to the work, the social work that the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers and other commemorative interventions do. I want to briefly touch on two other more specific points about what really moves me here. I think one is this idea that monuments and memorials help to create a new commons, a commons we need, that we've never had in this country. I think monuments function in a way similar to what is referred to colloquially as the talk, describing family rituals of Black youth racial and legal socialization designed to ensure survival in racially hostile environments. But how does this talk manifest outside of Black family contexts? I would argue that it is too often non-existent, and that memorials can help break that silence. We know from various sources that white Americans in particular have made a point of avoiding this talk, and often lean on the idea of colorblindness to rationalize that avoidance. So I think in that context, commemorative landscapes create really unique spaces for what I'll call racial resocialization, or in other words, reorienting us to these inherited constructs and structures of inequality. They emerge in this context of avoidance of critical reflection, indeed attempt to almost criminalize critical reflection on race and racial history, of highly motivated and disciplined ignorance about structural racism, this determination to look away. And in that context, we need rituals and resources and built environments that help to counter the avoidance and have the potential to bring us together in a new commons of mutual understanding and respect. And this is one of the things I feel is most important about built environments like memorials to enslaved laborers, but particularly because of the design as a gathering place, as creating a site of conscience that brings people together to continue the work of repair. The last thing I want to speak to was mentioned by a couple of the team members, is the specific issue of the brutalization of our culture and how we deal with that. A lot of the outcomes I described in terms of the social embodiment and reproduction of violence are evidence of the way we continue to enact the brutalization of our culture over generations. So we require built environments or civic arenas that help us deal with this, where we can acknowledge and disavow histories and legacies of dehumanization, for example, that are socially embodied and reproduced. Evident, for example, in our society's relative indifference to Black and other non-white girls and women who disappear or who are murdered, as we're seeing in this recent news cycle. The indifference to mass incarceration, to the unhoused, and the list goes on and on. And again, I want to hold up here the work these installations do potentially for white Americans. I'm thinking about reparations scholar and descendant of slavers Ronald Sly, who recently observed that reparative commemorative practices can be liberating for whites by allowing them to acknowledge actions of their ancestors done in their name, and to disavow, in other words, to create spaces for this acknowledgement, but also spaces to disavow and separate those actions from their own modern identities. There are very few contexts in our society for that kind of commemorative work, reparative work to occur. There are examples of the importance of this work from all across the world. And I just want to mention briefly the insights of South African scholar and community leader Pumla Gabodo Matikizele, who has played a key role in that nation's TRC process, but has recently discussed how that process has failed to address the brutalization of South African culture, and particularly the dehumanization that has been central to the white supremacist world system, including the apartheid regime. And she shared a story about a recent case of a Black child being brutally tortured for disciplinary reasons, with no regard for the child's human rights and respect and so forth, right to respect and so forth. And she stressed how this revealed that the transitional justice process, the approach taken there had not proven sufficiently transformative. And that, in other words, that the society continued to be capable of the kind of torture that was seen in this 21st century case that echoed the brutality of the apartheid regime. And here she mentioned, and I'll stop here, she stressed the importance of the arts in the unfinished work of transformative racial justice, the work of acknowledging and addressing a situation where, she put it, words are not enough. The arts and design play, I think, a really critical role in reparative efforts in the cultural valuational realm, in the realm of the construction of meaning and of feeling and so forth, or in other words, in remedies of recognition. And I think my hope is that interventions like the Memorial to Enslaved Laborers will prove to have helped facilitate the disembodiment of this historical trauma. And finally, how will we know? I think we will know when some of the outcomes I began with, the evidence of these legacies in forms like vote suppression and the violent discipline of children, particularly Black children in contemporary schools, mass incarceration and so forth, when those patterns are no longer so strongly tied to histories of slavery, lynching, and other racialized violence in our communities. So thank you again for your incredible work.
Well, hard act to follow. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all the design team members and others who were involved in this. And I will give a little bit of a perspective of what, in my role as, in a way, the steward of the campus and the university architect who thinks about both the past 120 years, but also less so, but we should more, the time before 120 years ago when this was developed as the new home of Washington University, but really acknowledge and think about the land on which we sit, especially on the Danforth campus. And to be honest, it's not something that we've recognized much on campus, either in a physical way, especially in a physical way on the campus. And I'm proud of what we've done in the past 10 or so years in terms of starting from our history of a castle on a hill and how to make a castle on the hill, and the history of very unwelcoming architecture and very hard and soft, not very soft, open, transformative architecture, and how we've been able to evolve that. And I think for those of you who know the campus or live on the campus or study on the campus, I think we've made some steps, but I think we have a long way to go. We've really evolved from acknowledging the masonry and very aggressive, somewhat architectural context we have, but hopefully in more recent work, we've really thought more holistically about landscape, about architecture, about engagement, and about welcome in a way that maybe a Castle on the Hill didn't do the best job of acknowledging. So just a few, as a university architect, I try to learn as much as I can from my community of my colleagues at other institutions, including UVA and colleges and universities throughout the country, in fact, throughout the world. And what can we learn from one another? Because usually there's one of us at each institution. So we really have a community that we share and learn from and get inspired by. And if this in particular, the process, the final work, the beauty, the poetry, the recognition of the history and the poetry of the project is one that is incredibly inspiring, and hope you and on our campus we can learn from and have some takeaways from this project. And there are a few things in particular, and real quick, because I know we're running out of time, but I was really impressed and want to continue to connect between the activism and even the student activism that started this project, the connection between the curriculum, research, teaching, and the physical space. I wish I could do that in every project I do. Many of the projects are solving a problem, and really, but as a university campus, we really have a responsibility and an opportunity, in fact, to connect our curriculum, our teaching, our research, our history, our future, and our physical space. So that's a lot of dots to connect, but I really take that as a core responsibility I have as a university architect working with the university's leaders. And how do you take all of this and embody it in the physical space? And the physical space being the buildings, the landscape, the public art, and the pieces and the threads that tie that all together. And over the past 10 years or so, we've really implemented a public art program. We've really thought more holistically about the relationship of buildings to landscape. And with the East End project, we hope to really open ourselves up to Forest Park. One anecdote, our land in and of itself has the history of both two pretty interesting and filled with stories that are not always the most positive stories, but not only the World's Fair, but also the Olympics were held on our site. And there's lots of history there to celebrate, but also to be critical of. So I think just acknowledging that on our campus, that it isn't all rosy and it isn't all positive, and there's lots of history that we should acknowledge and think about, particularly with those sort of layers we have on our campus of Olympics and World's Fair. It's sort of an interesting set of layers and lenses to think about our campus. I loved hearing about the process and just the number of faces and participants on the screen who were involved in this process from so many different disciplines and so many points of view, but that it together created such a meaningful and powerful project that included many not on this screen, the community engagement piece and the process that led to this project. Again, it's something I strive to do, and it's not always such a broad engagement process that a university engages with. So I was really impressed and hope to learn from your process and your participants. And then the last piece, as we think about our future at Washington University, especially on the Danforth campus, to create places and spaces and public art that is living and evolving, that we're not freezing ourselves in time. I mean, many of our contexts are, as I say, 120 years old and took their clues from Oxford and Cambridge. But how can we look forward and evolve what our university spaces are like and our community spaces are like to really think about the future, but acknowledge and think about and learn from the past as well. And by the engagement and the ongoing updating and evolution and programmatic use of what we saw today, I think is really inspiring. And I hope we can bring some of that where we can onto the university campus at WashU. And yeah, I'll leave it with that. But thank you all so much. It's inspiring, which is a great thing for me to take away from this and work forward as we continue to plan out our campus and our other sites.
All right, thank you, Jeff and James, for the great responses. Um, um, uh, to the design team, do you have time for a few questions from the audience if we have any? All right, so if anyone in the audience has any questions, there's a Q&A chat in the bottom. You can put your questions into there, and I can read them out. Give a minute here to see if anyone has any questions. Or maybe everyone's so overwhelmed by the presentation. It was really an amazing presentation.
I actually have a question, maybe while the audience is thinking. I can't believe 86 people have no questions. As someone who spent a few years as an event coordinator, coordinating a lecture series, I have a kind of geeky fascination with coordination. And something that stood out for me while listening to this incredible presentation was just how much just sheer coordination must have been involved in terms of bringing together some of the diverse voices that really make this project extraordinary, from community activists and descendants and students and professors. So I'm just wondering, how was this, was there a sort of central mastermind doing all the coordination, or it seems like a sort of miracle of like things coming together, and I realized there must have been some labor around that. I'd be very interested to hear how that worked.
I want to answer that because I think they're going to give you the wrong answer. But and I think that Meejin and Eric, always said from the beginning as they assembled the design team that this is a team of equals, and I think they mean it. And in some ways, this couldn't have happened without the contribution of everybody on the design team. But very definitely, they coordinated, they assembled the team. They're the ones that had the inspiration to put this team together, and they were responsible for coordinating the many meetings that we had. The visits, where Greg and I are in Charlottesville, but the others all had to visit. So enormous credit to them for that organizing structure that they provided, and the staff that they had, that worked with them as well.
I was going to answer it differently. I was going to say I felt like our team was like a hive mind, something in the future. But I think the coordination was enormous and done at all different scales throughout the process. And, Frank, Mabel, and to everyone was coordinating such complexity. And I think it was built on this value system of stakeholder advocacy, not just engagement, but creating a sense of ownership among many. And that just required both like one-on-one conversation as well as like, as you shared, Chantel, like event coordination and as well. So many scales of coordination were happening and still continue now. Mabel and Frank are actively working on still active, the website, the archive, Frank with the descendant community. So that work continues.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chantel. And I just had, we also had a great office of architects, Alice Rauscher, Mary Hughes, Sarita Herman, who are just right there with us. And the President's Commission was phenomenal. They really helped us make connections. They were incredibly knowledgeable. Like, we really walked into just an incredible community who understood the stakes of the project and were very open and engaged in getting this project completed. And we all sort of shared at every benchmark a kind of like, okay, we got that far, but we got to continue to push. And it was a really remarkable collaboration across so many different groups of people. It was unusual, I think, in that way.
Well, I think that covers the first question of the Q&A. I guess, Chantal, as you were speaking your question, the anonymous attendee was writing it. The next question was, what was the response, or what has the response been from the UVA community?
That's you, Frank. It's your workplace.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people will actually ask, well, what sort of opposition? Virtually none. You know, of course, there, you know, any time that white supremacy is challenged, you get pushback from that. But I think that actually the administration was, if they'd had any doubts before when August 11th, August 12th, 2017 happened, and the Unite the Right rally came to the university and came to Charlottesville, I think they were very, very pleased that we already had the memorial. The design was approved and, you know, was well underway. Ado's design was underway also. I think too that seeing the meaning of this that it had on the descendant community, the local African American community as proxy, because not all of them know the relationship to the people who actually worked, who were enslaved and so forth, because of course that was one of the elements that was taken away. So the university has had overwhelming support for it. And I was just out there 2 weeks ago, and they were giving a tour, and the guides were, and they said every student now has to visit the memorial. They have to have some sort of structured visit to the memorial, not just to go, but to actually have some sort of guided visit to the memorial to understand how important that history is as part of the mosaic that makes up the history of the University of Virginia.
All right, Ed Ford, who knows the campus quite well at UVA, says, I know the answer, but I think it would be useful to explain why the memorial is not on the lawn.
Mabel, you can answer that in part, right? Because you were there at one of these sort of iconic moments at the at Mount Zion First African Baptist Church, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Meejin showed, and we looked at 3 sites essentially, and one of them was the lawn. You know, there was the area in front of the library where the anatomical theater had been, and then what became as a triangle of grass. And I think what we heard from the community was that they didn't feel comfortable coming to the lawn. I mean, the university still referred to as, by some and perhaps many, as the plantation. And so coming into that precinct was not really an option, right? It just wouldn't have been accessible. And we thought that this really, you know, these are their ancestors and they have to be able to connect. And so somehow that area of the triangle of grass just somehow made sense, particularly as a threshold between Charlottesville, I think, and the university.
Oh, thank you, a very powerful answer. The next question kind of goes back to Chantel's and the first question in the Q&A about collaboration. How has this new way of working that Meejin described influenced the team members' work on new projects? What best practices do you continue to use today?
Maybe I will attempt, but please others jump in. I think we said from the outset of the project that a great idea can come from anywhere. You know, it can come from a member of the community, it can come from a member of the design team, it can come from the university. And so when we started, even though we each have a disciplinary designation and official role on the team, I would say concept design was a series of conversations and sketches, and everyone was designing, whether they were, you know, trained as an architect or not, or a landscape architect was doing architecture, architects were doing landscape. I mean, everyone was really working kind of collaboratively and organically. And I think that's one thing, like we think of disciplinary specialization, and of course we need that expertise once the project is well underway. But I think similar to ownership, like creating the sense of all being in it together, I think that was really important for the design team. And I think we think of that as an important part of the process. And yeah, learning moment.
I think if I could add to that, I saw it was Elizabeth Dunoff's question. I mean, I think you have to put together a team that is capable of addressing the sort of magnitude of the challenge. And I think this one was an incredibly important moment. We realized that we had to have a much bigger team, a much broader team with different kinds of expertise. And I think as we move forward, I think we still like to put together teams of people with different expertise. I think it was such a learning experience for us to work with this team. I think for other projects, we still think, who can contribute? How can we sort of broaden the breadth of the team? So I think we have all learned different ways of working, and I think as we go forward, we do think, maybe we should have a historian on our team. Maybe we should bring in a storyteller, a script writer. So I think it transformed all of us, and I do think as we go forward, we try to broaden our teams when we put together. We pursue projects or embark on projects like this.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, this is something that I've certainly learned and embrace, I think, in terms of practice. Having, I was working on this, I was working on a curatorial project that was very collaborative, and a more scholarly project that was incredibly collaborative. And I think, there's a way in which genius is privileged, which is often male genius, which is often white male genius, particularly within architecture, that then often flattens out the collaborative nature really of design to begin with. And it's also, it's I think critical for institutions to push institutions that you actually kind of come with your crew. In an army, like if you're the singular individual who's doing it, then I think a lot of times you're already embedded in the power structure. And I am actually finding that in order, especially if you're a woman or a person of color, you have to kind of be able to work outside, and you have to bring multiple voices in order to shift how institutions work. And I think that was certainly the case in the design process and just in the project in general. I mean, when do you have a client that doesn't know what they want, right? And so I think this was something that there was no easy answer to, even for UVA. And I think that's what made it powerful, is that we all then had to depend on one another to try to figure out what it was going to be.
And if I could also just echo my colleagues' comments, I definitely agree. Collaboration, forming a team of diverse participants and contributors is something that's really helped me, and have 4 new projects between Philadelphia, Alexandria, New York, and Mount Vernon, New York. And through all of them, and for me, it's interesting because I'm from Brooklyn, but like the project with UVA, going to new communities, going to places that maybe I've never been before, but sort of finding ways to connect with community stakeholders and get everyone to work collaboratively and participate in developing a new history is something that I learned from the UVA project that I kind of bring into other projects as well.
I could briefly flip that question and talk about the impact on the community. So we are still struggling with our legacy white supremacy. And part of that is our historic landscape. So just this summer, we removed 2 of the Confederate statues and other statues as well. And as we look at what is going to be happening to those places, that people like the Jefferson School, the African American Heritage Center, Historic Resources Commission, and community activists are saying, what we need to do is this collaborative process and this engagement process that involves everybody, but also centers the descendants and the African American community in particular, and have them determine what it is that needs to happen in this landscape to show who we aspire to be. So we're actually seeing that impact on the way that the community wants to come to terms with its history and with its landscape.
Yeah, Frank, I think your answer kind of touched on a question that Eric Ellingson put in the chat about the relationship to the Robert E. Lee statue as something being very vertical, coming out of the ground to be quite tall, versus your team's approach of kind of pushing it into the ground. I'm just kind of paraphrasing the question here. and that also kind of ties into the last question in the Q&A about the recommendation for commemorations in cities around the US. And so I guess merging those two questions together, was there conscious thoughts about the Robert E. Lee statue and kind of opposing that?
I mean, I think the idea of a kind of object as a kind of monument that's sort of meant to create awe and fear and intimidation, I think that was very much what we were reacting to. Instead of creating an object, we created a void or a space for people to fill. So I think it wasn't so much a kind of a commentary on Robert E. Lee, but or the Confederate monuments, but really just a shift in thinking from monuments and monumentality to memory. We often use those terms interchangeably, but one is about scale and intimidation. The other is about memory, and how can we shift it from intimidation and something vertical and powerful to something which is evocative of memory or triggering of memories. So I think it was a deliberate choice to go away from the object towards the kind of clearing, towards a kind of void, but also to trigger memory and contemplation. So I think it was deliberately a kind of counter to that previous paradigm of the kind of intimidating object sculpture. And I like what Mabel said about the singular author genius versus the kind of collective hive mind. I think we sort of enacted a kind of collectivity to challenge the kind of singular gesture.
I think one thing that we didn't really emphasize in presentation was the number of other sites that we looked at on the grounds. And I think as a team, each time we looked at a site, we thought, this is the one. And then we would move to another one, saying, now this is the one. And I think this process of moving through those sites and listening to people and realizing that this site needed to have a face out to the city was really important, and not be embedded within the grounds and become something that would be people in the community would see on a daily basis and drive by, became very important. And then it became, how do you deal with the site and the landscape and the space, and then thinking about how you can work with the land and make those things all come together. So I don't think as a team we really had a particular attitude about monuments or even making a monument. We were much more interested in making a place that was going to be memorable.
All right, it's a little past 7:30, so maybe it's a good time to wrap it up. So thank you so much to the team. This is just quite a coordination just to give the lecture. The way that you gave the lecture, and it felt very in sync with each other. So it was really quite an impressive lecture format and tone and message. So really great job. Thank you so much for reaching out to our community here and sharing this with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.